Argument basics. In philosophy, an argument is not a fight, dispute, or disagreement. Rather, it has a technical meaning. And the technical meaning is this. An argument is a set of claims that are related in such a way that one of them, known as the conclusion, is supposed to be supported by the others, or other, depending on how many you've got, which are known as the premise or premises. To be a bit more specific in terms of the concepts, a claim is a statement that is either true or false. In an argument, a premise is a claim given as evidence or a reason for accepting the conclusion. And the conclusion is a claim that is supposed to be supported by the premises. An argument has one and only one conclusion, and it answers the question, what is the point? In terms of the premises, there can be many. They're unlimited. And they answer the question, why should I accept the conclusion? Now, arguments split into two main flavors, third if you consider bad a flavor. The first is the inductive argument. And an inductive argument, in philosophy, you might see it defined differently elsewhere, but in philosophy, an inductive argument is an argument in which the premises are intended to provide some degree of support, but less than complete support for the conclusion. A deductive argument, in philosophy, is an argument in which the premises are intended to provide complete support for the conclusion. And we'll see more in the future about induction, deduction, partial support, complete support. Now, I mentioned the bad flavor earlier as well, and in philosophy, that bad flavor argument is known as the fallacy. So a fallacy is a type of argument, but it is a bad argument. It's an argument in which the premises fail to provide adequate support for the conclusion. So it does have a point being made, reasons are being offered, but the logic is bad. And there are many, many, many fallacies. So, argument consists of one conclusion and one or more premises. And so when you're looking for them, you would ask, kind of speech or something written to find the conclusion. To see if there is one, you'd ask, what is the point here? If there's no point, no argument. If there's a point, then there could be an argument. Then you'd ask, what reasons, if any, are being given? And if there are reasons, these would be the premises. And if you have both the conclusion and one or more premises, you would have an argument. And it could be good or it could be bad. More on the good and the bad coming up. So how do you tell when you've got a good argument? Well, there are two general assessments of arguments. The first is assessing the quality of the reasoning, the logic. The second is assessing the content of the premises. So, roughly put, the first question is the reasoning good? And the second question is, are the premises true, or at least plausible? To get into a bit more detail, when you're assessing the reasoning, the logic of an argument, the question to ask is this: do the premises logically support the conclusion? Now, I mentioned deduction and induction earlier, and it's here they split up. They're both arguments, of course. So inductive arguments have premises and a conclusion, deductive arguments have premise and a conclusion, but where they differ is how they work logically and how they're assessed. If an argument is deductive, the question to ask in terms of assessing the reasoning is this: is the argument valid or invalid? A valid argument is such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion must be true. It's important to note that being valid doesn't mean that the premises are true or that the conclusion is true. It's a conditional. It means that if the premises were true, then the conclusion must be true. So, for example, as a simple valid argument, consider this one. If today is Tuesday, then tomorrow is Wednesday. First premise. Second premise, today is Tuesday. Conclusion, tomorrow is Wednesday. And looking at it, it's clearly, good logic, because if it's true that today is Tuesday and it's true that Wednesday follows Tuesday, then it would be true that tomorrow is Wednesday. So in that case, it happens that, when I'm recording this on a Tuesday, so it's true that it's Tuesday, it's true that Wednesday follows Tuesday, and it's true tomorrow is Wednesday. So all the premises are true. But if I gave the same argument on a Wednesday or Thursday or Friday, and you may be listening to this argument on a day other than Tuesday, the argument would still be valid, because a valid argument doesn't mean that the premises are true or the conclusion is true. It means that if they were true, the premises, then the conclusion must be true. So if you're listening to this on a Wednesday, that argument is still valid. It just doesn't happen to be Tuesday. Because if it were Tuesday, and it's true that Wednesday follows Tuesday, then it would be true in that case that tomorrow would be Wednesday. So validity is about the quality of the logic, not about whether the content is true or false. To use an analogy, you can think of a valid argument like doing, say, a mortgage calculation. Imagine you're taking a class, you're learning how to calculate mortgages, say a business class. Now when you do the calculations, you don't actually have to go and buy a house to take the class. So you can do correct, equations, do the math right, even about things that aren't true. As another example, if you're taking a class, say in physics, or you're doing equations about things moving and exploding and so forth, you don't actually have to move things or blow things up. You can still do the equations right. They're valid equations. If you were to put in true stuff, you get out a correct result. And so valid doesn't mean true. It means, perfect logic. Now, the opposite of valid is invalid. An invalid argument is such that all the premises could be true and the conclusion false at the same time. So logic is bad. Now, just as valid doesn't mean true, invalid doesn't mean false. You could have an invalid argument, bad logic, in which everything in there is true. For example, premise 1. If Tallahassee is a capital of Florida, then it's in Florida. Premise 2. Tallahassee is in Florida. Conclusion, Tallahassee is the capital of Florida. Everything I've said is true, but the logic is bad. Although it is, appealing because everything I've said is true and it seems to make sense. But we can take the same exact argument and end up with a false conclusion. For example, if Gainesville is a capital of Florida, then it must be in Florida. True. Gainesville is in Florida. True. Conclusion, Gainesville is the capital of Florida. Not true. And so that's an invalid argument. In that case, clearly, because we can see that it could have all true premises and a false conclusion. Now, in terms of how we test deductive arguments or being strong or weak, we use truth tables, Venn diagrams, proofs, etc. But this isn't a logic class, so we won't talk about that stuff. Now, what about inductive arguments? Well, with inductive arguments, they're all technically invalid, because by their very nature, they could all have all true premises and a false conclusion. But that's okay, because they're not trying to be valid. They're trying to be strong and trying to avoid being weak. So they're both arguments, but they're different. To use an analogy, consider sports. Running is a sport, and so is basketball. But they're assessed, differently. Like if a basketball player just ran across the court incredibly fast, people wouldn't say, wow, he won the basketball if he was the first one to run across the court, because that's not how they assessed. But if it's a track meet and someone runs really fast and is the first across the line, then they would win the track meet. So with that analogy, just as sports is sports, arguments are arguments, but they're assessed differently, different goals to win, so to speak. So in the case of the inductive arguments, they're going to be strong or weak. A strong argument is such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion is likely to be true. Not guaranteed, though. A weak argument is such that even if all the premises were true, then the conclusion is not likely to be true, given those premises. And this is a relative and degree thing. So arguments are strong or weak relative to each other, and it does come in degrees. So you can have really strong arguments, really weak arguments, etc. Now, there's not typically an exact cutoff informally to say, okay, this argument is definitively weak, although since inductive arguments are often used in statistics, etc., or surveys and polls, they do set standards. So in a professional context, for example, if you're doing a controlled cause-to-effect experiment, which is a form of inductive argument, or you're doing a political survey, then you'd have a certain standard of strength you'd have to meet. In everyday life, though, the measure is basically practicality. How much are you risking, and what is the cost of being wrong? So if you're using an inductive argument and it's something that could kill you, you'd want a pretty strong argument before you say tried a cure for COVID. If someone said, hey, this will cure COVID, and the argument was not very strong and it could potentially kill you, you'd want a better argument. But if someone says, hey, this breakfast cereal's on sale for $1 a box and it's pretty good, well, you might not need a really strong argument for that because the risk is low. And this gets into all kinds of matters of assessing stuff. So strong means if the premises were true, the conclusion is likely to be true given those premises. A weak argument is such that the premises don't provide adequate support, so even if the premises were true, then the conclusion is not likely to be true because of the premises being true. Now, unlike deductive arguments, which are strictly valid or invalid, inductive arguments are, again, measured in degrees, strong or weak. Also, deductive arguments are assessed very objectively. You have truth tables and diagrams, proofs, so you know for sure valid or invalid. With inductive arguments, as we'll see, they're assessed in terms of standards that are specific to a particular type of argument. So although they're all arguments and all inductive arguments are inductive, they have different standards used to assess them. As we'll see, an argument by analogy is assessed differently than an argument by example in terms of the standards applied. So assessing deductive arguments is exactly like assessing mathematics. It's correct or incorrect, objectively so. Assessing inductive arguments is similar somewhat to judging, say, the Olympic sport of figure skating, because there are standards and you're observing something, but you're applying standards, and different people can honestly see things differently. So that's assessing the reasoning, and we'll say more about deduction and induction a bit in the future. So the second main question is, are the premises true or at least plausible? This is a question of content. So how do you tell whether a premise is plausible or not? Well, essentially it's a matter of knowing stuff. So the more you know, as they say, the better you are at assessing premises. But if you don't happen to know the content, here's how you test premises for plausibility. The first is, if it's applicable, you would match the premise against your own observations. Now, this doesn't guarantee that your observations are correct and that the premise is true if it matches your observations or false if it goes against them, but in general it's a decent test. So if it's something that you have observed yourself and the premise is consistent with it, plus. If it's something that you've observed yourself and the premise is not consistent with it, that would be a minus. Second, going to what you know and your experience, etc., you would test a premise against your background, beliefs and experience. And if it matches that, that's a plus. If it goes against it, would be a minus. But of course, we have to keep in mind that our background, experience, and beliefs could be false. So we could be matching a true premise up against a false belief. And we all believe false things. I know I believed a lot of false things because I found out, like, hey, that's false. And I'm sure I believe a lot of false things now. I just don't know they're false, because if I knew they're false, I wouldn't believe them. So I'm sure there's a lot of things lurking around in my mind that are untrue, but I don't know that yet. And the same is true for all of us, so we want to be careful. Which is why the third condition is checking the premise against credible sources, such as experts, standard references, textbooks, etc. And as you might imagine, especially these days when expertise in it is under constant attack and knowing stuff is under constant attack, this can be challenging because people often go to Twitter, Facebook, questionable sites, etc. for their information, and often ignore people who are qualified experts, in part because experts tend to be boring and they don't always agree with people's biases and prejudices. But if you want to know whether something is probably true or not, the thing to seek out is credible sources and also legitimate experts. And unfortunately, this has become, and well, in a way, to be honest, always has been, a matter of great debate. So when it comes to assessing arguments, the two questions are, do the premises logically support the conclusion? That is to say, is the reasoning good? And the second question to ask is, are the premises true or at least plausible? Now, as I noted before, the quality of the reasoning and the quality of the content are distinct. You need both to have what we call a good argument, but they're separate, qualities, which is why we have the notion of fallacy, which applies to bad logic, and the notion of false claim, which applies to, claims that are false, something being untrue. So arguments are not true or false. They would be, valid or invalid, strong or weak. And premises are not, being strict about it, not valid or invalid. Premises are true or false. So what happens if you actually get an argument that is valid and has true premises? Well, that would be the diamond standard of argument. It would be what's known in philosophy as a sound argument. And so in order to know if an argument is sound, you need to answer both questions, it's valid and it's got all true premises. So if you know an argument is sound, you know a lot about it. You know it's an argument, you know it's valid, you know it's got all true premises. Now if it's unsound, well, you know that it is either invalid or valid, and you know it may or may not have all true premises. So from being unsound, you can't tell a great deal. You can tell some. If it's unsound, it can't be sound, clearly, but it kind of limits what you know about it. Now, in the case of inductive arguments, if they're strong and have all true premises, they're often referred to as being cogent. So it doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is true, but a cogent argument would be as good as induction gets. Now again, this is a matter of both quality of reasoning and quality of content. And they're two separate things, as I noted, because we separate fallacies from false claims. To use an analogy to illustrate it, think about cooking. Roughly speaking, there's two ways that a meal can go well or badly in terms of preparation. One is in the cooking part. Think of that as like logic. That's how the meal is, the ingredients are assembled, mixed, combined, and then perhaps cooked. And the ingredients are like the premises, addressing the question of their quality. So think of like the ways a meal could be. You could have really good ingredients, analogous to true premises, and they could be prepared really well. And that would be like ideally like a deductive valid argument or a strong argument. So that would be a really good argument. Good argument would be like the good meal. Good ingredients, well prepared. But of course you could also have bad ingredients to work with, but have them prepared very well. Someone could be like a great chef facing some bizarre challenge where they have to make a meal using just horrible ingredients. Or a person maybe like, out in the woods, or just run out of food, be a really good cook and just not have a lot of stuff to work with. You just have like some slugs and dirt and, rocks to work with. And so the cooking could be, incredible, but they're terrible ingredients to work with. And that would be like an argument which has good logic, but has bad, premises that are implausible or false. Now, of course, you could also have something where you have really, really good ingredients. Someone, goes to the store, spends a lot of money buying the finest, vegetables and meats or tofu, and buys all this really good stuff. But then they're terrible at cooking. They burn everything and, put in too much, or too little salt and spices and so forth. And so they end up with like a burned, horrible mess. So that'd be like an argument with bad logic and good premises. Great ingredients put together terribly. And of course you can have the worst case scenario, which would be bad logic and bad content. And that would be like a meal where the ingredients are terrible. You got like some slugs and some dirt and some rocks and twigs and dirty water, and they're combined horrible. Someone making all that even worse. And that'd be the worst case scenario. So those are the general ways to assess arguments. Now, in terms of how these would be used, if you're looking at someone else's argument and you want to assess it fairly, those are the two questions you'd ask. Does this person's argument have the logic that supports the conclusion or not? Is it valid or invalid if it's deductive? Is it strong or weak if it's inductive? And the second question to ask is, are the premises true or at least plausible? Now, when you're building your own arguments, you also want to ask these questions. You'd want to ask, is my argument good? If I'm trying to make a deductive argument, is it valid or invalid? If I'm building an inductive argument, is it strong or weak? And then when you're advancing your premises, the same thing. You'd want to present premises that are true or at least plausible. So that's the basics of assessing arguments. Next, we'll move on to looking at deductive arguments a bit more, and then look a bit at inductive arguments, and then look at some inductive arguments that will be useful for writing the paper. Because although this is not a logic or critical thinking class, in order to understand like the arguments people make philosophically, you'll need these argument basics. And of course, in order to write the paper, to craft your own arguments, if you don't already know like how to argue philosophically, then you'll need this stuff to be able to do the paper. And as I'll note when we talk about the paper, I'm working from the assumption that people come to the class with no prior philosophical experience, and so it's all new. And if it's not all new, well then you're probably not watching this video. You probably have skipped it. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.